Welcome everyone to Stay in Your Lane. I'm your host, John Mahle. Stay in Your Lane is produced and put together by Triple T Transport. As you know, today I'm going to step outside of the trucking industry a little bit and talk about something that I don't know a great deal about, but I'm intrigued by it. I want to share with you. Today we've got Jesse Alderman and Michael DeClercq. Michael is the founder of CPG Sourcing, and Jesse and I communicated, and you work for Michael. It seems like a pretty special arrangement, which I like to see. I like to see people that are passionate. That always draws me in. But CPG Sourcing, I would love for you, Jesse, to share. I will start with you. Share what CPG Sourcing does before we get into questions, and then we'll get back to Michael here in just a second. Go ahead, Jesse.
Oh, sure. Thanks, John. So CPG Sourcing, we are a company that helps people who import, businesses that import direct from Chinese manufacturers. So if you are importing a long time and you have you already have your manufacturers established, we help those kinds of clients to supply vet other manufacturers, see if we can get a better quality, better price with on-time delivery for the products that they're sourcing. But we also help clients who are new to sourcing in general. So as you know, China's pretty far away and there's cultural differences and there's exchange differences. There's a lot of differences between the United States or the Western world and China. So we essentially are the sourcing office in China for people who need a sourcing office in China because they are not in China. So if you're importing a lot from China, or even a little bit, if you're importing anything from China, you're going to need someone on the ground to vet your suppliers, to do factory audits, to do product sampling, to do kind of all of the different touches that are involved in getting your product delivered from China.
Wow, that's definitely, I would say, uh, in depth. It's probably something that is a continual process, and it's a lot, especially if you have like we have language barriers, you have cultural barriers, things of that. Now, Michael, you started the company in 1978. Um, what caused you to start the company?
Excellent question, John. 1978, guess what? I was a little bit younger than I am today. And I had started this business in China because I was interested in business at that time. I was a young entrepreneur. And China had just pretty much burst on the scene as a potential commercial behemoth, if you want, in 1978, except that pretty much everything that had to be done had yet to be done. China exported very little to the United States at that time, something to the tune of 300 or 400 million dollars, which is nothing compared to what it is today, about $500 billion. And the Chinese market beckoned, um, but it was very early stages. And so we had developed two divisions, John. One to sell to the Chinese market, which is primarily industrial products, and the other one was to buy from China what China could produce for the U.S. market. And we got more involved in the buying side because it was a cash flow business, and our fledgling enterprise needed cash, as all fledgling enterprises do. So the selling process was quite lucrative, but it took a long time. It might take you 2 years before you could close a sale. But the buying part was much more regular. And so we started to introduce this, and of course it came with all the attributes of long distance sourcing. Quality control is absolutely essential because by the time you pay for merchandise, it ships, and you receive it, if you discover in the container that the goods do not conform to your expectations, you've got a very serious crisis on your hand, because the goods have been promised to people, etc. It's a nightmare.
Yeah, there's
So
commitments that are going to be broken. What's transit time, if you don't mind me asking, for containers from
well,
China to the
the
U.S.?
transit time is about 4 weeks to the West Coast, and you got to count, say, about 6 weeks to the East Coast. And of course, as you know, there are problems now with the Panama Canal. So sometimes people ship to the West Coast and use a mini land bridge, to connect either to cities like in the Midwest, cities like Chicago, but all the way until the East Coast sometimes, depending on availability of transport.
Wow. So I've always expected it to be 6 weeks because I'm in the Midwest, which isn't far from the East Coast ports. Our normal thought process is 6 weeks
Right.
in the best case scenario.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, you know that you can get faster transit depending on shipping companies. For
Yep.
example, Maersk is significantly more expensive in terms of seagoing vessels, but the vessels are faster. So Maersk will get you the merchandise quicker to the West Coast, whereas Costco is much cheaper, but it'll take quite a few more days. Um, and of course, John, some people can't wait, so they'll use air freight, and
Right.
it's quite common lately to use that.
Wow. Pretty amazing. So uh, we're, I would say, in somewhat difficult times from an economic perspective with the economy. Seems to be slowing down a little bit in the U.S. a little bit. They're talking about dropping interest rates here in the next couple of weeks. We're going to see a bump, try and pick back up some of it from what we're hearing. How has nearshoring impacted your business or what you're seeing people? Are you seeing companies that were reaching out or people that were reaching out for China manufacturing, reaching out or backing away from China and heading more towards the Mexico region? Or are you seeing the shift go back the other way?
Well, it's definitely not going back the other way, John. There's a geopolitical factor here, which is
Correct.
basically the relations between the U.S. and the Chinese government that have created a tariff dynamics that is encouraging nearshoring.
Okay.
But if you look at data and statistics, uh, you realize immediately that reshoring, which is not your question, but reshoring, meaning back to the United States, has largely not been successful,
Correct.
mostly because companies seek the lowest first cost possible, the lowest, I should say, landed cost possible.
Yep.
And China is a very difficult place to be, especially for more sophisticated products. Um, Nearshoring, as you said, is primarily a Mexico play.
Right.
And I mean, theoretically, you could nearshore to Canada, but it doesn't make sense in terms of labor costs. So it's primarily a Mexico play, but surprisingly, it doesn't work very well either. So the the most evident impact of tariffs has been, creating more supply chains in countries like Vietnam. And I mean, Vietnam, I think, has been one of the major beneficiaries, but also Thailand and to a lesser extent, Indonesia, places like that. Of course, traditionally, Bangladesh and Pakistan have been alternative suppliers for Chinese merchandise, especially textiles. But China has been so even when you do an alternative supplier like Vietnam, the first cost is higher than what it is in China. It's very difficult to match Chinese first costs. But because the tariffs are lower, it becomes, an interesting way to, let's say, balance your supply chain.
Yeah, I would say I probably didn't personally think that the tariff situation would be huge or a deciding factor in the difference between China and, let's say, Vietnam. But logistically, I think it's tough to beat China from a logistical perspective. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean it's very tough. It's very tough, especially for sophisticated products. So take, for example, the iPhone, which is a very sophisticated product. It's assembled primarily in China, although Apple is, setting up factories elsewhere as well, and that's a good example to what you were referring to in places like India. But and again, as far as I know, I don't think Apple set up factories in Mexico. Again, thinking about nearshoring. But but what a lot of people don't realize is that this complexity of an iPhone is composed of a lot of very complicated, very expensive chips, components, if you want, of the
Correct.
iPhone.
Mhm.
And those are made in places like South Korea and Taiwan. And so China is more of an assembly. But the assembly is so efficient that it is very difficult to beat in terms of cost. And as you know, in the marketplace, if you have the low first cost, you tend to have an edge, which is difficult to beat. And that's what most importers are looking for.
Continue watching on the next episode of the Stay in Your Lane podcast.